Well, thanks for joining the Thought Decoders podcast with Sean Mixon. Today I'm joined by the man, the myth, the legend, none other than Justin Brierley. He's written a very impressive book. As a matter of fact, Justin, I recently heard Dr. Craig mention in a podcast. He says he doesn't often read books that are written for a popular audience. But he said, except I'm reading Justin Brierley's book currently right now, and I was like, whoa, that's a really big endorsement. And the title of your latest book is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. And the subtitle says, Why New Atheism Grew Old and Secular Thinkers Are Considering Christianity Again. For those of you who don't know Justin Brierley, and how do you pronounce your last name? Just so I'm not self-conscious.
Exactly right, Brierley. So thank you. It's not one that people always get right.
Okay, because I didn't want to screw it up. In the back of my mind, it's like you're slaughtering. It's not his name. Yeah. So Justin has had some of the most epic, legendary debates, and on his podcast, his former podcast that he led, called Unbelievable. He's had Timothy McGrew, N.T. Wright, and Tom Holland, William Lane Craig. Can people still find your interviews from Unbelievable online?
Oh yeah. The whole archive is there. You just search up Unbelievable podcast or look at the YouTube videos. Maybe you're thinking of Sean Carroll. He did a debate with Bill.
Well, not Sean Carroll, but I guess I was thinking about he's an elderly guy at this point. Oh, he's an elderly man. Roger Penrose.
Roger Penrose. Yes, that was a
Roger
great discussion
Penrose
between Bill Craig and Roger Penrose. Yeah.
Right. I was like, this is amazing, and I know. Well, I have the impression that was something that Dr. Craig, that was probably on his bucket list. Talk to.
He really loved being able to take part in that. I remember when William Lane Craig was over in the UK. This was, I think, in 2019, and I was able to suggest, putting him in conversation with Roger Penrose, who is obviously a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and Bill has taken a direct interest in his work through his Kalam cosmological argument, because Penrose, along with Hawking, developed some of those singularity theorems that obviously Bill has done and had a lot of interest in investigating. And so it was kind of like a dream come true in a funny way for Bill to be talking to him, and they had a really good conversation, actually. And I think because Penrose wasn't coming kind of as a kind of hardened atheist exactly to the conversation, he was quite open, actually, and interested in what Bill had to say. And Penrose is interesting because he does believe in this kind of the existence of a mathematical realm that's independent of the kind of material realm, and Bill was all over that because he believes that too, but he thinks you can only kind of make sense of how we have access to that if there is a God, basically. So there's just a super interesting conversation between the two of them.
Right. And so just to name some more dialogues that you've hosted, Jonathan Romaine and Michael Brown. I watched that one. He had Hugh Ross versus Peter Atkins. He had Bishop Robert Barron versus Alex O'Connor. I mean, just a host. Peter J. Williams versus Bart Ehrman. Tom Holland versus Tom Wright.
Not really versus. They got on like a house on fire, that Tom Wright and Tom Holland. But there was a very sparky debate between Tom Holland and A.C. Grayling, who's sort of quite a well-known atheist philosopher. So yeah.
And I see that you have the plus sign on with Tom Holland plus Tom Wright, so which maybe speaks to that what you just pointing out.
That's right.
Michaela Peterson. You've had Jordan Peterson on. Was that?
That's right. Yeah. That was probably our most ever viewed show, and probably continues to be. I think the last time I looked, it was over 3 million views of Jordan Peterson in conversation with Susan Blackmore, an atheist psychologist. So that was a very memorable one as well.
Right. So suffice it to say that you've had some of the greatest minds in the world in conversation over a 17-year period.
Yeah. So the
Right.
show began in 2005, The Unbelievable Show, initially just on radio. So it started just on Premier Christian Radio in the UK. We started podcasting about 2 years later. So we were pretty early adopters of podcasting in 2007. But this was still before, people could get podcasts on their phones and things like that. So podcasting really kind of took off really in the 2010s. And at that point, we kind of organically saw a lot more people listening, both Christian and non-Christian, to the show through podcast. Eventually, we also joined, YouTube as well in 2018, and started to post a lot of our shows there as well. So yeah, it was wonderful to be able to host, moderate, hundreds and hundreds of these conversations between Christians and atheists and agnostics and people of other worldviews too.
Yeah, and in many ways, to me at least, you're like the godfather of Christian podcasting. I mean, you were one of the first people that I saw doing it to the level that you've done it on for so many years, and I was like, man, that would be really cool to do what he's doing. So in many ways, you've influenced my channel.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
One of the reasons I started my own channel, because I was like, man, that just must be really cool to talk to to the brightest minds in the world. It's just that's amazing to me. And so, just to transition, you've recently written your second book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and in the book, you're kind of tracking the so-called new atheists. Could you define what like the new atheists are for our audience?
Well, the new atheism was a movement that kind of rose around the time I started The Unbelievable Show, which was in 2005. And that was around the time that this movement was kind of gaining a head of steam, led by biologists and journalists and philosophers like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett. These were the so-called four horsemen of the new atheism, each with their own best-selling anti-God book. So one of the well-known ones, obviously, is The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. And they were sort of spearheading a kind of informally, if you like, spearheading a movement that was really about a very dogmatic kind of dismissive form of atheism that ridiculed religion, that saw it as pernicious, evil, irrelevant to our culture, and was partly, I think, responding to things like 9/11. And so because I think there had been that sense that religion can do really terrible things in the world, there was a kind of reaction to that. Also to some cultural issues going on in the US at the time around whether intelligent design should be taught alongside evolution in the classrooms. There was a real sense among some secular folk that, religion had too much of a foothold. But I think it was really fueled by the growth of the internet as well. And it was the ability of lots of like-minded skeptics to kind of find each other in chat rooms and forums and early forms of social media. And that kind of and YouTube as well, like was, as that came online, that was a real place where a lot of atheists kind of found each other through their videos and their communities and so on. So it was sort of, it was a movement that kind of obviously thought that the problems of the world would be solved if we basically eradicated religion. And so, as I say, it had this quite aggressive sort of tone to it, because atheism obviously has been around for a long time, but it tended to be more in the kind of academic circles that it got talked about. This was a much more popular level form of atheism, and so that was what it looked like. I mean, one manifestation of it here in the UK was something called the Atheist Bus Campaign. So these were a lot of red London buses that an atheist organisation sponsored with the words, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." And those were, circulating around the London capital. And this was the closest thing, atheism had ever had in our country to an advertising campaign. So it was an interesting kind of moment. And it lasted, I would say for somewhere around maybe 10 years, really, that movement had a lot of life in it. But it did eventually sort of fade off and even, I would argue, internally imploded as well. for all kinds of interesting reasons. But it was in a way, I didn't, in a sense, it was a good thing in a sense, the New Atheism, for what I was doing, which was hosting these conversations, because it was a really obvious sort of opponent, that you could put in front of a camera or microphone to engage these questions about God and belief, because they definitely had a perspective. They weren't sort of just, they weren't just sort of agnostic or uncaring about the thing. They really kind of were ready to put their perspective forward. So it was a good way of kind of bringing people together in debate, as we were able to bring some of those characters into conversation with Christians.
Okay, and so the title of your book is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. An obvious question, what was surprising about the rebirth of belief in God?
Well, I think the rebirth that I talk about in the book is really what I've noticed happening in terms of the conversations since the New Atheism, as I say, has kind of tailed off. Because at the time when, these New Atheists were writing their books and, popular, it was very difficult to talk in serious terms in the public sphere about religion. Because the response at the time from most people was, well, this is just fairy tales, nonsense, superstitious thinking. And what I noticed was, as the New Atheism tailed off, and as increasingly the kinds of non-believers who came on my show started to distance themselves actually from that New Atheist movement, there was just a lot more openness eventually among even non-believers, secular people, to the value of Christianity, and that actually maybe they'd thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And the question of, well, what do we replace God with and the Christian story with in the 21st century West? And so I was increasingly speaking to interesting people who were not necessarily Christians, but who were not anti-religious. They kind of saw the value in Christian faith. And that itself was surprising, because, as I say, that was a real sea change in the kind of the kinds of conversations you could have compared to, say, 10 or 15 years earlier. And so I was sort of interested that this seemed to be happening. And on top of that, the other surprising element of this was kind of running into more and more stories of people who, as adults, as 21st century thinking, intelligent people, had embraced Christianity and were suddenly finding that it did make sense of their life. And the more I ran into those stories as well, I realized that there might be something changing in the culture. And so that's why I call it the surprising rebirth of belief in God, because I think there has been a quite interesting turn just in the last several years away from that sort of very sort of secular, atheistic kind of bent that was kind of on the rise in our culture, to actually suddenly people seeming to take the God question far more seriously. And so that's what I would say is surprising about it.
Okay, and so basically, would you say that you have a historical thesis where you're trying to explain how we got here by just probably reviewing the last couple of years, and basically, or are you arguing something about the past and the future, like how we got here and where we're going? Like, how would you frame what you're doing in this book?
I think obviously I initially my kind of focus is this new atheist phase, which is quite recent, and the way in which the conversation has changed only in the last several years. But I do kind of put the focus out a bit wider in the book as well, to the fact that new atheism itself was only in a way a kind of symptom of a wider kind of secularization, de-Christianization of the West. And that's been going on for a few centuries, really, ever since the Enlightenment, arguably. And to that extent, there's a bigger story to tell about the way that the Christian story has kind of in the West, while it completely defined the West for, maybe 1800 years or so, we've just in the last couple of centuries, we've seen the Christian story go into retreat in the West. So it does not so much inform the imagination and the daily lives of everybody, in the West in the way it used to. And what I've noticed is, when you combine that, the loss of the Christian story, with the rise of other stories about how life should be lived, and the acceleration of technology, social media, and everything else in our current age, the thesis I have is that we're experiencing something what psychologists sometimes call a meaning crisis in our culture, because we've lost the Christian story, but we haven't replaced it with a story that makes sense of our life, that's equivalent in depth and meaning. And people are kind of, I think, grabbing onto a lot of other types of stories in our culture now. Political mythologies on the right, kind of sacred identities and things on the left, trying to kind of put those in the place of Christianity or God. But I don't think that it's working for people. I think that's why we've got the culture wars. I think it's why we're seeing a lot of what we see. So that I do kind of sketch out a kind of something of a historical case for why we're at where we're at, and why I think this might be the reason why we are seeing this return to interest in Christianity and whether it can provide answers to some of these deep questions that people still have and are becoming ever more acute, I think, in our culture at the moment.
Okay, and so that's your thesis. Let's talk about how you support it, or how you develop this idea in your book. So what are the big case studies, so to speak, that you like to think about in this book, or what's your evidence for the thesis? Some of the most important pieces.
Yeah, well, on this one, Sean, I'm going to hold my hands up and say this is not, in a sense, an academic thesis where I've kind of marshaled a great deal of, data in the field to kind of support a case. A lot of what I'm describing here in the book is essentially anecdotal. It's the sense that I've had through the conversations I've been part of, and kind of watching as a bystander this rise and fall of new atheism, and seeing a number of interesting characters come to the fore, like Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland and Ayaan Hirsi Ali and others who are kind of these kind of secular people, but who are kind of pointing people back towards Christianity. It's kind of my sense that something is happening in that way. The only real statistics I include in the book are obviously the ones that we all know about, which are that there's a downward trend in the West of church going, Christian affiliation, and everything else. So that's, but obviously that does not speak to a rebirth of belief in God. And when I posted this, the title of the book on Twitter, when it was released, a lot of atheists, responded, well, of course there's no surprising rebirth of belief in God. Just look at the statistics. And I didn't disagree with them on that front, because I was quoting those same statistics in my book. So what, if I'm identifying anything, I think all I'm identifying is that there's a change in the atmosphere and a sort of a turning of the tide. And that's a metaphor I use in the book, and that's on the front cover, that there's this idea, there was this famous poem, Dover Beach, by Matthew Arnold, a Victorian poet, which talked about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith in his generation, 150 years ago. Well, that tide has well and truly gone out in the West, in the past century and a half. But I think the tide could turn. That's the point of a sea. It doesn't just withdraw, it can come back in. And I think we're kind of due for one of those returns of the sea, if you like. And I think you can show this historically, that there have always been times when, especially the church, at various points in its history and in different places in the world, looks like it's kind of due to die. And there's been obviously many predictions of the death of the church. But often what you've seen is something happen in the culture, some kind of revival that happens and brings the church back, that looked like it was on the way out, and it comes back. So I think there's a kind of a cycle of death and rebirth in the church itself, and we kind of might be in one of those situations at the moment. Having said all that essentially that what I'm drawing on is more anecdotal, and my perception of what's been happening from my interactions with people. It is interesting to see that there is just a little bit of data coming through that could support the thesis that we're starting to see a revival of interest in Christianity at a wider level. One interesting, again, it's only a small piece of data, it could be an anomaly, who knows, but the church in Finland published an interesting set of statistics that showed that in the past, I think it's the past 5 years or so, church attendance, Bible reading, and prayer has more or less doubled among young men, which is not the demographic you would expect in a very secular European country to be the demographic where there's been a doubling of those things. So that seems interesting, and I think, and then I've seen other statistics of a similar nature that suggest that it's among the most unchurched, dechurched part of the population, that kind of sort of Gen Z 18 to 35-year-olds, where actually it appears that there's more openness now to the idea of God and faith and church and Christianity than there is among older people, interestingly. And I almost wonder whether it's one of those things where sometimes people have to let sort of an older generation that thinks they know what Christianity, it kind of has to, they have to let go of it. And it's almost in the younger generation who don't have those associations where you can suddenly find that there's a new openness. So yeah, that's my overall case. As I say, this isn't an academic work that draws on lots of studies and that kind of thing. It's more a sense of my own sense that something is changing in the atmosphere, drawing on particular people and evidences in that way.
Yeah, I think there's a case that can be made, and I think you do make a kind of case for this in the sense that you point out to the quote unquote leaders of new atheism, and their impact on culture has been, it's been massive. And to think that leaders within this movement are becoming sympathetic to Christianity, all one must do is just think about the future impact of their choices, of that choice to be more sympathetic to Christianity, and how that would influence those same people that they may have encouraged to become atheists themselves. So it's like the about facing of these individuals towards a theistic conception of the world. And to me, that's a pretty good argument, especially if, like take the Apostle Paul, right? They knew in the New Testament, they knew that he was, responsible for the deaths of many Christians. And so once he became converted, it's like, wait a minute, Paul? Right. And so just by virtue of God, and I'll speak this way, God choosing Paul and Paul converting to Christianity, we don't know. It's a plausible case that can be made that people begin to be interested in Christianity, to say the least. They're like, what, how did this happen? How do you go from persecuting Christians to becoming one and promoting? And so I think in the same sense, this is what you're pointing out in your book. You're saying, look at these people. And again, that's another surprising fact, because these individuals several years ago, we would not have expected these strongly atheistic individuals to now become sympathetic to Christianity. I mean, that's why it makes the news once they come out.
Yeah. I mean, a good example of this is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who I mentioned earlier, who doesn't feature in the book because actually her story is so recent that it kind of, it happened after the book got published. But I have covered it in this new documentary podcast series that accompanies the book, and that's a fascinating case in point. She is this Somali-born Dutch former new atheist who, at the time that she left radical Islam in the sort of late 90s, and she kind of fell in with sort of the new atheists, and in the kind of mid 2000s was very much part of that speaking circuit, sharing stages with them, addressing crowds about why we need to leave religion behind and so on. And her book Infidel, which she wrote, was a good example of that kind of new atheist type literature at the time. But then only recently, in November last year, she wrote this viral article on the Unheard website called Why I Am Now a Christian. And it almost was like a Paul of Damascus moment, Paul on the road to Damascus moment for me, because I thought, my goodness, if it can happen to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, it could happen to anyone. And the story there was simply that she just came to realize over the last several years that atheist materialism cannot provide the kind of foundation for our culture to provide a bulwark against fundamentalist Islam, some of the powerful regimes in the world, China, Russia, or what she sees as the kind of corrosive effects of kind of a woke ideology as well on the left. And so she kind of has embraced Christianity partly for kind of cultural reasons in that sense, though it appears she's also gone on a personal spiritual journey here, and which she opened up in some detail about in an interview subsequently, about her own kind of sense that she needed something more than atheism could offer to for her sense of purpose and meaning and identity. And so everything about her story kind of chimed with so many aspects of what I was noticing already among a number of other public thinkers, not necessarily who have gone quite as far as her in sort of publicly embracing Christianity, but who are certainly somewhere on that journey. And like you said, one of the interesting parts of this is that it's often these new atheists who are now realizing that new atheism itself was a kind of mistaken project. It didn't bring about this, utopia of science and reason and harmony, because that's not the way people are wired. You can't simply tear God down and think that science is going to kind of give people everything they need. I think what a lot of new atheists have realized, kind of a bit too late, is that people are inherently religious, and if they're not being religious about God, they're going to be religious about something else, and that's going to pose just as many problems for you as them being religious about God. So it's been really interesting to see that, and yeah, I suppose in that sense that those are objective examples, if you like, of some of these interesting figures who have really changed their mind either about the cultural value of Christianity or indeed seem to be embracing Christianity, which again is very surprising. So yeah, that's you've helped me to kind of think about that at a slightly more objective level there.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you look at the reasons for the mass exodus of young people out of the church. I was just at a conference, and they said the top reason is evolution, right? The top reason is what scientists, or how the scientists are presenting science. And James Tour, the famous chemist at Rice, makes this notion all the time. He's like, I'm a scientist. When I study this stuff, I know that we don't know how this is done. But when scientists are public, we're going to invent life in 3 days from now. We're going to have it walking out of our labs. It's just, it's an exaggeration. And most people who don't study science, they hear that and it's like, oh, well, maybe life isn't a miracle. Maybe it was easy. So maybe we don't need God to do it after all. And for the masses of people who are generally not experts at science or any of these fields that the new atheists were particular experts in, they just took the new atheists' word for this stuff. I didn't study science, but I'm reading Dawkins' The God Delusion. He's a scientist. So for these people who are experts in their fields to become more open to theism, it's going to have a mass ripple effect in society. And I think you're right.
I mean, when it comes to the, because there's two streams, aren't there? There's people who are leaving the church, as you say, and maybe it's because of some kind of conflict they see between science and faith. And there's kind of also the people who are coming into the church, perhaps for other reasons. I mean, I think in some ways it's to kind of stop people leaving and to encourage people to enter. It's going to be both, and it's going to be both churches kind of getting more serious about science and the way it integrates with Christian faith. Because I think there has been a genuine reason for people to leave church where they've not done a good job of showing the way in which science and faith complement each other. They have basically created a kind of conflict narrative within the church of science and faith. But at the same time, I think there's also, from outside the church, I think that very strongly atheistic version of science that Dawkins and Krauss and others were peddling for a number of years, I think that has basically, that's been dialed down an awful lot. You're not getting these big conferences where, religion is being disparaged and science is being praised. You're getting a lot more nuanced conversations on how science and faith interact, and hearing a lot more from interesting voices who are actually in public spaces saying that. Like, for instance, another example I would give of the way the conversation has changed recently is that, on Joe Rogan's podcast last year, Stephen Mayer, a well-known intelligent design advocate, had a 3-hour show with Joe Rogan And that would have almost been unthinkable, 15 years ago, because that was like, that option was like almost heretical to even kind of like bring into like serious secular conversations. But now it's like, oh, for some reason, the atmosphere has changed so much that the idea that there might be an agency beyond science engaging in this whole thing suddenly doesn't seem laughable, and I just feel like, it's examples like that tell me that from outside the church, there's a kind of more of an openness to Christianity, to theism. From inside the church, I think there's also been some important work done to help churches engage science in a more productive way, so that we don't, hopefully we can stop people leaving the church because they feel like there's a conflict of science, and we can help people outside the church think about joining the church because they see, actually, it feels like science kind of is pointing in the direction of God. So I'm kind of encouraged in both directions in that way.
Okay, and so what are the takeaways? What should we be hopeful? I heard you say in another interview that you're an optimist. So what are the takeaways that you hope someone reading your book will walk away with?
Well, I do hope it'll give a sense of optimism, because a lot of the articles and podcasts I listen to these days can be quite depressing, frankly, because there are a lot of issues in the church. There's been a lot of scandals. There's been, we're constantly bombarded by the deconstruction story and the, ex-evangelicals and the decline of the church and these kind of things. But actually, I think sometimes we tend to focus on our little slice of history and the kingdom. And the fact is, God is always doing something bigger than our little epoch of history. And I just wonder whether this is just a sign that a change is on the horizon. I think sometimes it's good to remind ourselves that God is not finished with the church, even if we do a pretty bad job very often of being the church and representing him well. Actually, God still uses us, and God can still work despite our flaws. And so I'm hoping to inject a bit of a note of hope and optimism, I guess, because I do think that there's something happening, and that actually, if we're willing to lean into that and look at the kinds of new questions people are asking as the kind of atheist kind of phase starts to diminish, I think there's still lots of challenges because we live in a complex culture. But I think the church has never had actually more opportunity, arguably now, to encourage people to investigate the Christian story again, because people are looking for a story to make sense of their lives by. And as I said earlier, I think they're looking in all the wrong places in our culture. But there's some interesting voices, even outside the church, people like Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Douglas Murray, and numerous others that I talk about in the book, who are recognizing, even, as people who are standing from outside the church, that there's a real value to Christian faith. And I've seen a lot of people walk through that door that they've opened. So it's my kind of encouragement, really, to the church to learn some lessons from why people who are choosing to walk through that door are doing so, and to kind of maybe learn how we could kind of encourage and kind of best receive these meaning seekers, the people who are kind of experiencing this meaning crisis in the West, and welcome them back into a church that is ready to give them answers and ready to tell its story again.
Right. So, wow, I had a question, but you just threw. I'm thinking about the meaning seekers, but I'll continue if we have some time. I'll go back to that. But what is some advice that you would give to like a youth pastor or the leader of some religious or Christian church or organization? How can they position themselves to be more to how can they get rid of this conflict thesis between science and faith? Like what have you seen that works? What have you seen that doesn't work? What should they start doing? What should they stop?
I think the first thing is to take the science seriously, and that is to look at the ways in which some of our best science is pointing towards a kind of agency in the universe. And there are some great people out there, with as I say, Stephen Meyer has done some great work with his outfit, and there are lots of others, but not necessarily Christians either. Like if you go and read someone like Paul Davies, you'll find, a fascinating set of facts about the way our universe is, that he doesn't kind of necessarily name God, but he certainly says there's some kind of purpose or directionality in the universe. And I think it's just encouraging to see the way that just doing good science can lead to these conclusions that actually there's more to the universe, there's more to life than just sort of pure physics, chemistry, that it all boils down to just purely natural processes. So I think go and actually, expose yourself, and don't be afraid to expose your flock, your congregation to good science. And then obviously you have to do the work of, making sure that you don't present a kind of a version of the Bible that is obviously in direct contrast to, I guess, some basic scientific facts. And for me, this will mean actually having to really do some good study in the scripture to work out what parts of scripture are meant to be understood, in a very literal sense, as history, as biography, and so on, and which parts, for example, the early chapters of Genesis, I would argue, you're not necessarily going to them for a scientific account of how the world was created. It's not written to be that, because God has given us a book of revelation in scripture that is sort of about God's purposes in creation, and he's also given us the book of nature as a kind of that we can explore, through our senses and through science, to give us a sense of the how, if you like, that happened. So I'm kind of I think it's just about being wise students of scripture, wise students of science, and in the process, I think it can be a real gift, science. I think lots of churches sadly see it as a sort of stumbling block to faith, but I actually think science can be an amazing way in for people to see the harmony of the natural world and the revelation of God in scripture. So I'm always disappointed when I hear of people for whom science has for some reason been like this thing that put them off faith, when I think actually done right, it can be really encouraging and, create a real enthusiasm actually for God and for just the awesome majesty really of God in the universe. So yeah, I would say embrace it and find the ways in, because I know a lot of young people for whom, if you just sort of start with the Bible and God and scripture, their eyes kind of glaze over. But if you kind of play them some video of, the awesomeness of the universe, they're like, wow, this is amazing, But I think that's a really good way into kind of getting a picture of God as well. So I think that would be my advice for those who are trying to put that together and help young people and their congregations to navigate that.
What you're saying to me is consistent with the advice of the Apostle Peter, who said, "And add to your faith knowledge." Right? This sense that we should be literate, biblically literate, but scientifically literate as well. I think about the Apostle Paul, who says, "Beware of vain philosophy." But if you don't know what philosophy is, how can you beware of vain philosophy? Right? You have no discernment, because we can't identify what a thing is. We don't know what the earmarks of philosophy are, and so we can't tell if it's vain or not. So I think what you're pointing to is just this tendency to be afraid of what we don't understand, and to just challenge ourselves as ministers, as Christians, as believers, pastors, youth pastors, to dive into the knowledge. All truth is God's truth. If we believe that God is real, why would we be intimidated by anything? Right? That should, if you really believe that God made the world, why should you be afraid to read, anything?
And I think sometimes we just need to remember our history as well, because the pioneers of the scientific revolution in the 17th, 18th century were Christians basically, and they were fueled by their faith in God. That was what made them go out and explore an orderly, rational universe, because they believed in a reasoned, orderly mind that had put it there in place. And so So, and that's just a fact of history. That is why they did what they did. That's why the scientific revolution got going. Now, the problem is we tend to only ever see science through a modern filter that has been kind of told to us by the secularists, Dawkins and everyone, that, oh, science disproves God. That was never, that is a very modern idea, and it is not the history of science and faith. And likewise, though, I would want to kind of encourage pastors, youth pastors, to kind of introduce their congregation, their young people, to great scientists who are Christians today, you know, people who are doing amazing work in their field and see no contradiction between their faith and their science, because I think that alone can simply undo this myth that there's a big contradiction between science and faith when they see people doing great science who are also committed believers, because sometimes you just need an example to just dispel this idea. So yeah, I think those are some of the ways that we could helpfully kind of bust this myth of science versus faith.
Absolutely. And what I like about your book is you show how the new atheists become examples for a theistic worldview through their change from hostility to sympathy for the Christian perspectives and the Christian value system. So I think that's the genius of what you're pointing out here, and why many scholars are seeing that it is an important work. Like I said,
oh, that's very kind. Thank you.
Yeah, arguably the greatest Christian apologist of the last 50 years, Bill Craig, says he doesn't read many popular level books, but he was reading your book, and then in another podcast he was quoting your book.
yes. No, I was very grateful for that. And I mean, a little fun fact though, that probably the reason Bill had the book to read was because we were both you and I met, Sean, at the Biblical Worldview Conference in Dallas back in September, and Bill was obviously speaking there as well. And so I was able to give him a copy of the book, and he read it on the flight back home. So that's why he kind of had it fresh in his mind and devoted some episodes of Reasonable Faith to it, which I was very grateful for. But yeah, it's been great. It's been great to see actually lots of people who have picked the book up and have really appreciated it. So yeah, it's an exciting time, and yeah, if people want to get hold of it themselves, they can go via my website, justinbrierley.com. I should also mention that there's also a documentary podcast series that accompanies it, which is a kind of really deep dive into some of the themes from the book and talking to a lot of the people that I feature in the book. So if you're a podcast listener, if you just look for the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, you'll find that there as well.
And I'll put the link in the comments. But thank you, Justin Brierley, for joining us for a wonderful podcast today. The man, the myth, the legend. We have really feasted on your experience and on your insight. And thank you for watching Thought Decoded with Sean Mixon. And thank our guest once again. And always remember to think better.